I'm Professor Jim Franklin, Chair of the Politics and Government Department. And before we introduce our speaker, I'd like to talk about the Benjamin F. Marsh Lecture Series on Public Affairs that makes this possible. Ben Marsh graduated from Ohio Wesleyan University in 1950. That was during the long career of Professor Ben Arneson, who encouraged students to sign a pledge to engage in public affairs. Ben Marsh signed this pledge, and he certainly made good on his promise, serving in a number of important public positions in the city, county, and federal levels throughout his life. These include solicitor for the city of Maumee, president of the Ohio Municipal League, election supervisor in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and a representative of the U.S. to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. Ben endowed this lectureship in 1999. And through his generosity, we have been able to sponsor 20 lectures by some of the most prominent scholars and leaders in the country. Ben regularly took part in these lectures until he passed away in 2014. Other members of the Marsh family usually attended these. They're not able to attend this year, but we hope to see them in the future. And I want to express our gratitude to the Marsh family as this lecture series continues to enrich the campus and community alike with important discussions on public affairs. And actually, to introduce our speaker, we have President Rock Jones of Ohio Wesleyan University.
Thank you, Jim, and good evening. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you here. We're especially pleased to have a number of our members of our Board of Trustees who have come in early prior to the beginning of our meetings at noon tomorrow to hear their colleague and Vice Chair Nick Calio speak this evening. Before introducing Nick, I'd like to, if I may, share my favorite Ben Marsh story. It comes from Mock Convention 2012. Ben Marsh, as Jim said, graduated in 1950. So you can do the math. 2012, 62 years later. Ben Marsh, we asked to come from Toledo to speak to the students and others in Mock Convention. He took the podium in Gray Chapel in the midst of the convention, and he reached into his hip pocket and he pulled out his wallet, and he opened the wallet and he took from it a tattered piece of paper that was his signed Arneson pledge. With an eye toward serving the public interest and regardless of my future vocation, I pledge to devote a portion of my life after college to active and definite participation in public affairs. 62 years he carried that card and lived that pledge. And this lectureship gives us the opportunity to continue to live that pledge and to contemplate the importance of public affairs. More than 180 years ago, as you know, Alexis de Tocqueville came to this country from France to study the emerging American experiment in democracy and to compare how democracy was developing in this country to democracy on his own continent. And of course, the result of that study was the great work, Democracy in America, in which he reflected on the emergence of democracy here. He reflected on the ways in which he saw strength in democracy on this continent that he saw missing on the European continent, and in which he reflected on those things that might be a risk to the future of democracy. I want to share two things that he wrote in the large volume. One, the action of the legislature on the executive power may be direct, but it may, on the other hand, be indirect. The struggle between the president and the legislature must always be an unequal one, since the latter is certain of bearing down all resistance by persevering in its plans. The matter of the president and the legislature. And on another topic, Americans of all ages, all conditions, all minds constantly unite. Not only do they have commercial and industrial associations in which all take part, but they also have 1,000 other kinds. If it is a question of bringing to light a truth or developing a sentiment with the support of a great example, they associate. Now, why do I read these passages from Tocqueville from nearly 2 centuries ago this evening? Because our speaker tonight is a person who has devoted his professional life to the institutions of democracy in this country. And in particular, he has served presidents of this country in relation to the Congress. He served President George H.W. Bush and then President George W. Bush as the Director of Legislative Affairs. He led the White House efforts on Capitol Hill. He has the capacity to bring together people from both parties, from both sides of the aisle, to accomplish good. Nick Calio reflects what Tocqueville saw in the emerging democracy in this country, in the separation of powers and the work of those who support the president in working with Congress. He has spent other portions of his professional career with associations, industry and trade associations, more recently as the Executive Vice President for Global Government Relations for Citigroup. When I met Nick, he was in that role overseeing all of Citigroup's government relations with nations all over the world. And then over the last 8 years or so as the CEO of Airlines for America, the association that represents the airline industry and serves all of us who travel from time to time by air. Jason Downey from our Board of Trustees, who is here this evening, follows the transportation industry in his work as an investment manager at Diamond Hill Capital in Columbus. Jason told me not long after Nick assumed his responsibilities at Airlines for America that he was in Dallas visiting the leadership of Southwest. And as they made their case for investing in the airline industry, and in particular investing in Southwest, they said, and there's one thing since you were last here. Our association has a new leader, Nick Calio. He's the best of the best, and we will be well served, as will our country. We're fortunate that Nick Calio is one of our own. He is a graduate of Ohio Wesleyan. He and his wife Lydia met here. They live in Washington, where they have 3 children and they have grandchildren. Nick has served Ohio Wesleyan as a trustee for more than a decade, currently serves in his first year as the vice chair of our board. He and Lydia support the institution in numerous ways, including recently endowing a scholarship to provide what Nick himself received as a first-generation college student, and that was the support necessary for an Ohio Wesleyan education. I'm honored to be able to introduce our friend, our colleague, and a wonderful public servant, Nick Calio.
Geez, I'm kind of, oh, wait a second, I have to turn myself on, sorry. I'm kind of thinking I might just keep seated. Rock, thank you very much. I want to thank Rock. I want to thank the Marsh family. I would like to thank Mike Gessler and Jim and the whole Politics and Government Department for the opportunity to be here tonight. It's very special for me. I was not a politics and government major, and I'll get to that in a little bit. But Ben Marsh, as you were told, spent a lifetime committed to public service. He endowed this lecture to encourage Ohio Wesleyan students to do the same, and I hope that along the way that I can do the same thing, because we have a lot of good students. If you look at our list of alumni here, we have many who have served the government, served in public service in many different ways. It is a gratifying job, it's a worthwhile pursuit, and it's something that is in long-standing tradition and goals of this university. So, I wanted to recognize my wife Lydia, my partner of almost 42 years. I would also like to recognize Sue Murray, the director of my office, and Rebecca Spicer, my head of communications, who came out here because we had a run-through the other day, and while they didn't say so directly, they were pretty convinced that I could not handle the clicker to move the slides. And might go too far off script. So I want to start. I've got a little bit of a cough, so I apologize. I might have to turn this off for a second. I want to talk about why I'm here tonight. I want to talk about our governing process and the right and importance of advocating causes or lobbying, which always has kind of a dirty term attached to it, which I do not think it should. I'd like to maybe shed some light in my view, because all of this, look, it's a lecture, so I get to say whatever I want. It's personal experience. Context our current politics by looking back and talk about how politics and advocacy in this country have changed over the years. Sometimes not for the better, but I do think there's hope for the future. First, why I'm here. We're all products of our personal experiences, so I am going to touch a lot on the autobiographical. As Rock noted, I've spent my entire adult life since leaving Ohio Wesleyan and then leaving law school at the intersection of business and government, and particularly at the intersection of the executive and legislative branch relations in this country, which is nothing more fascinating than you can find in terms of the daily tensions and the need to know and understand people. A note that may be of interest and one that underscores the value and the practical application of a traditional liberal arts education is that I was an English major. While I was here, I took a single politics and government course, Introduction to Poli-Sci or whatever it was called, but Bill Louthan was my teacher and he's here tonight. So in looking back, I thought about why did I not take more advantage of the politics and government department? I'm thinking now that I might have been afraid to go to the classes. Thank you for laughing. At any rate, I hope to provide some kind of sense about how important it is to engage and how rewarding if you make the move into the public service sector. It can be so rewarding because you're in the middle of everything. You can get things done. You can actually have an impact. And I have to tell you too, it can be a lot of fun. And I've decided tonight to do some PowerPoints. I'm normally not a PowerPoint person. It terrifies me. But I thought that some slides and photos might help guide the discussion along the way and maybe bring to life some of the points I want to make about working in politics and in terms of intra-branch relationships and the merits of bipartisanship, which has become increasingly rare, as we all know and talk about. So you know from what Rock said and from my introduction and bio that Lydia and I have met here. I had already graduated when we met. I've been a long-term member of the Board of Trustees. So believe it or not, I got recruited to Ohio Wesleyan by the football coach in 1971. They were looking for a very large bruising running back, and that was me. I grew up in Cleveland, very decidedly 1950s type neighborhood. My mother immigrated from Italy. My father was born here but was Italian American, and they drilled into us constantly the need to get an education, the need to do something with your education, to apply your education. There was a big problem. Nobody else in my family had gone to college. I had no frame of reference, and we couldn't afford it. But I came down here, I talked to the football coach, and I thought, because no one was there to advise me, that my answer to that no money problem was an athletic scholarship. And I didn't realize that good grades helped along the way, but happily that came with the package. So anyway, I talked to Jack Fouts, who was the football coach, about coming here, because I came down here and just everybody was so friendly, it was so nice, and I fell in love, and I told my father, I want to come here. At the end of the discussion, the coach says to me, we don't do scholarships, athletic scholarships. So I was crushed. It didn't last very long. He said, no, I want you to walk over to University Hall and I want you to meet with Fred Pollock, who was the head of financial aid. And Fred Pollock said to me that if you want to come here, Nick, we will make that possible and we will do everything we can to make sure that while you are here, you feel like every other student. You're probably going to have to do work study. You might have to take some loans, but we're going to make it possible. I came here, and soon after I came, I got this letter. And it told me that I had been named a Lytic Scholar Athlete and received a grant of $2,500. Tuition and room and board, if I didn't say this before, was $3,300 at the time. I got a grant for $2,500. I had a work-study program. I worked at the kitchen at Smith. And here's what I looked like when I came. So I wasn't truly making fun of the politics and government department, but you know, you got to love that Fu Manchu in the hair. Anyway, I did come here. I got a great education. I had a blast along the way, but Ohio Wesleyan gave me the basis and the grounding for learning so much and everything that came afterwards in my life. So I always felt grateful for it. When I had those photos, I never thought in my lifetime. I was ambitious, I was looking for opportunity, but I never thought I would own photos like that when I was back here in college. It's a matter of embracing your possibilities and your opportunities. I think personally that a traditional liberal arts education has a lot to do with that. It gives you a way of thinking, a way of life, a way of community, and that's what we got out of Ohio Wesleyan. So because of that Lytic scholarship and all the other help I got at Ohio Wesleyan, because Ohio Wesleyan held true to its promise to me, in 2014, Lydia and I endowed a scholarship intended for students like me who needed help to get here. I am very proud to say that there's been 6 recipients to date. 3 of them are here. I thank them for coming. 2 of them happen to be from my high school in Cleveland, and I have nothing to do with it, totally by happenstance. But it's probably the most gratifying thing that we've ever done. So it's a great thing. Now, to the meat of the lecture, Congress, the White House, and business, bipartisanship and partisan politics. I have to confess that I had to come up with the title of that in December so the press release could go out. I'm not going to talk much about business. I'm going to talk about the other stuff. But the title's there, and it's been encumbering me for weeks. So, governing is a process, we all know that, the parameters of which are defined by our Constitution. It's a document that is elegant in its simplicity and in its durability. The concepts are very simple, and you all know this, so I don't mean to be, lecture too much, but it is the power resides with the executive branch, with the Congress, with the judiciary, and of course, with the people. Article 1 grants all the legislative powers to the Congress and defines how the Congress is to be designed. Article 2 gives loose powers to the presidency of the United States, and that loose power is what has caused, Article 1 defines some of the notions of separation of powers and checks and balances, which caused the tension a lot with the executive branch. The First Amendment formally gave birth to the right to lobby, to petition your government, the thing that many people find awkward and like to criticize, and I do want to address that. So there you have it. It's pretty simple. Governing, as I said, is a process. The simplicity of those articles and the language in those articles in no way tells you about the daily complexity, tension, and conflict of governing. Conflict, I always tell people, conflict is inherent in our Constitution. It was meant to be because that conflict, those opposing views are designed to bring people together to come to a view, some kind of reasoning that best supports majority interest. Does it always happen? Maybe not. More often than not, it does. Okay, so you hear all the time, or at least I do, it's like being in the airline business. You go to cocktail parties and people want to tell you about their last flight all the time. Being in government or being a lobbyist, people want to tell you how bad it all is. So, I hear all the time, our government has never been this bad, this dysfunctional, this ineffective, this partisan, and sometimes, as my brother told me 6 months ago, and it's the fault of all those damn special interests and lobbyists. Rock knows my brothers and my relationship, so it's odd, but okay, I get it. So 2 points worth examining here in terms of that supposition. First, about lobbyists. The term came into usage in the 1800s. There's 2 stories about how it started, either in the New York State Capitol or in the Willard Hotel in Washington, where Ulysses S. Grant used to go smoke his cigars. I prefer the one about the Willard because I can see it out my office window. It's very nice and it's a little more dramatic, and Washington, New York have all the credit. At any rate, the term came into usage in the U.S. Capitol in the 1800s, and oftentimes being used pejoratively, as if there was something wrong with petitioning the government for some cause. Simply put, lobbying is advocating a particular point of view to promote, defend, or maintain a cause or a proposal using the art of persuading others to your side of an argument. Also, what I also like to tell people is, look at it. You're being critical, but virtually every interest is by definition special and has representatives. Colleges and universities, corporations, labor, churches, charities, industry groups, public interest and environmental groups, senior citizens, you name it, all have organizations that represent them. And you have this plethora of information constantly going into the government and to the decision makers to inform their decision making. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. It's become increasingly important over time because we've become a more complex society. It's legitimate and necessary for that reason. This print, titled The Lobbyist, is from the cover of an 1888 Harper's Weekly. I've had it in my office for over 30 years. I love it because it epitomizes what a lot of people think about lobbyists and what they do. If you look at him closely, he's looking pretty smug, smoking a cigar, and if you look on the table over here, he's got at least 3 different types of liquid in different glasses, presumably all alcohol, right? I know some of you are under 21, but it's a great job if you can get it, right? In truth, there are a lot of social aspects to being a lobbyist because it's very much a people business. As in all walks of life, relationships matter. And generally speaking, to persuade someone to your point of view in any walk of life, there has to be trust and credibility, and part of that is knowing people, and part of that can be socially. Years ago, when I was back at my high school, and I was getting some ancient sports award, I was talking to this gentleman who had an insurance company, and he was being hypercritical and saying, you guys this and you guys that, and you do this, you're taking people out to dinner, you're buying their votes. I said, okay, I said, tell me something. Do you go to the Browns games? He said, yeah, I have a box. I said, what about the Indians? I said, yeah, I have a box. He said, yeah, I have a box. I said, who do you take? He said, my clients. You buy in their business? So I'm not trying to be defensive or defensive, but it's the point. You get to know people socially, you can create more trust. Not going to mean they're going to give you everything you want or do everything you want, but it creates a better kind of relationship to work. That would be a great job if that was all there was to being a lobbyist, but there's also what I call the scut work, which is knowing the issues and the policy, the other person and organization, and everything that motivates them, their background, what influences them, what they need to come to your point of view that you're advocating. And then, of course, also the flip side of that, what are you willing to give up to get them to come to your point of view? Because nobody, at least in the politics that I've been involved in, and it does seem to be current today, you can't get everything you want. You know, Ronald Reagan, who's now considered a great president, was the master at that. He would set out what he wanted. He'd get 60% of it, and he'd walk out of there and say, we won, and everybody thought he won. And all these people, at least on the Republican side of the aisle, who revere him, don't understand that he was a master compromiser along the way. Anyway, my point is, if you want to be effective, it takes a lot of homework. Now, for the second point worth examining, in terms of the context for what's going on today, that our government has never been this partisan or this dysfunctional. I'm not going to argue tonight the dysfunctional part of it, and I will get into that because I think it is. The partisan part, well, it's a little bit different story if you look back. Take some really early examples. Presidents Adams and Jefferson, Treasury Secretary Hamilton and Vice President Burr, and then Senator Sumner and Congressman Brooks. A little later, about 1840s, 1850s. These people pilloried each other every single day. They owned their own publications, and they would put out these daily criticisms and scourges. And then, of course, to get it down to a more basic level, Burr killed Hamilton, and Brooks caned Sumner on the Senate floor. So even by today's standards, that would be a little bit rough. But they made politics a blood sport. Still, if you look through that period of history, on large issues, people came together because they knew their duty and they knew their responsibility, and at the end of the day, they could actually talk to each other about what was going on. And just to drive the point home, this is another print. I have a lot of stuff in my office. This is the House floor in the mid-1800s. And when people tell me how civil the discourse used to be, no, this is what it was like. People were screaming at each other all the time and yelling at each other and fighting. But different things happen later. So, have things changed? I think the answer is yes, certainly since I started in the business. And it starts with technology for one thing. Okay, so I moved to Washington 1 week after graduating law school. I got married the next week, and then I started with a small law firm the week after. 6 years later, somehow I ended up being a lobbyist for a trade association and the head of government relations. And my boss gave me this very pager, which is the same pager the White House gave me in 1989 when I first went there. You would wear it on your belt, and it would buzz. That's it. You'd have to go find a landline somewhere to call back to the office to find out who was calling you that was so urgent, and then hope to stay on that same landline to call them back. In 1984, right after I started becoming a lobbyist, Motorola introduced the first cell phone, affectionately called the Brick. It was called the Brick because it was heavier than a brick and bigger than a brick. I was one of the first lobbyists to have one. I was very proud of it. My boss and I shared one because of the expense. The reliability was about 50% because you could only call landlines because almost no one else had one. If you were going to be out of the office for a while and wanted to carry it with you and needed the charger was the size of a very large briefcase. So we've come a long way. I point that out mainly for the students here because you don't know how far and how fast things have come. If you think about Adams and Jefferson and Burr and Hamilton, among others, it would take months for those attacks that they published to reach their target audiences because distribution was limited and communication was very, very slow. Now, or going back, in reading, looking back, in the late 80s and early 90s, cable TV, C-SPAN, radio and TV talk shows were just starting to come into vogue. I know that's hard to believe, but it's kind of crazy. Oh, and the one question I wanted to ask about the cell phone, for the students here, how many of you have ever made a phone call from a phone booth? We have one. Were you here in Europe? But the point is technology has changed so rapidly. So email only really came into vogue in the early 90s, and it was very limited. So things have changed pretty quickly, and it has really changed political discourse. If you fast forward from the advent of cable TV and 24-hour news cycle, which I will talk about a little later as detrimental in my personal view, and get to social media, the changes are enormous in how people communicate with each other and also in terms of how they get to deal with each other. So the answer to the question, is it getting harder to reach across the aisle? My personal view is yes. I've watched it up close and personal for over 35 years. The reasons are varied. Not one thing is singly responsible. I already talked about the 24-hour news cycle. Another is the way the congressional districts are drawn, the way Congress has changed in terms of how the leadership of the House and Senate controls most of the agenda instead of the committee staff, because there's some good bipartisan work going on at those levels. But then when it gets to the leadership level, sometimes it's difficult to let something happen because it chalks up for the next general election one way or the other. And the question is, how do you break through that? But there are ways to get things done. So I was told that I had to identify these people for the students. In the early 80s, President Ronald Reagan on the right in the top picture and Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill are a really good example. They were diametrically opposed in ideology, and they were committed opponents, and I mean that as a compliment, committed opponents on most issues. Still, they reveled in having a drink together, two Irish guys, telling jokes and telling stories to each other. When the opportunity or the need arose, including when it might cause political risk, they did get together. The best example is in 1983, they came into 1983 having opposed each other for 2 years on issues like tax cuts and defense spending. And they got together to put reforms in place to the Social Security system that kept that system from going bankrupt for over a generation. Pretty considerable. Later, a couple of years later, Reagan and his then Vice President George H.W. Bush got together with this gentleman, Dan Rostenkowski, who was your prototypical old-time Chicago politician and the Democratic chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee, which was in charge of tax writing. They ended up passing the Tax Reform Act of 1986. It took 2 years to get that bill down and hundreds of trade-offs, but they did get it done. I had come into lobbying the business just before that bill was getting started. At that time, Republicans, I will get back to John Boehner, the then Speaker of the House, and President Obama later, because it says something about where the parties are now. At any rate, when I got into lobbying, Republicans were basically a permanent minority. They had been in the minority for over 40 years, mostly, all the time in the House and a lot of time in the Senate. So if you were outside the government and you wanted to get things done, you had to know and work with Democrats and Republicans. Rostenkowski and I, a Democrat, for whatever reason, became friends, and he actually became my mentor, which a lot of people find hard to believe because of difference in parties. He once told the New York Times that the big Pole and the little Italian have similar chemistry. I bought the chemistry thing. The little thing was a bit of a wound. At any rate, Rosti, as he was known, and George H.W. Bush had served on the Ways and Means Committee together in the late 1960s and had remained friends ever since. After the '88 election, Rostenkowski called the president-elect and recommended that he hire me to run relations with the House of Representatives. So those were different times. They were very different times. I missed this meeting that I was supposed to have, this symposium I was supposed to be on last Friday with Doris Kearns Goodwin, the famous historian. And she was saying about the same thing that I'm about to say. And a bunch of us get together and lament this all the time because in the old days, members would argue all day long, and it would be vigorous, it would be nasty, it would be mean. It was common. It was just as common that evening they would go out and they would have drinks and dinner together and talk to each other and yuck it up. And the next day, go back and argue all over again. They socialized, they got to know each other, they knew each other's families. They didn't personalize their political differences. And I think it's a lot harder to personalize your political differences when you know the person you're criticizing. Emblematic of that was, it was on, if you look at the House floor, I don't know if anybody watched the State of the Union last night, but if you did, we watched part of it from a bar downtown. And there's the Republican side, there's the Democratic side. When I was growing up in the business, it was very common to see members crossing back and forth to the other side of the aisle and talking to each other. And they each had a cloakroom in the back of the House floor where they had lunch stands, and a lot of times cross-pollination. They just go talk, have lunch together, and then go back to arguing. That doesn't happen anymore. If you ever watch on C-SPAN or watch coverage of the House floor, watch carefully. Nobody moves across the aisle. If somebody does, look even more closely and look at the reaction, because people on the side where the person crossed from are saying, what the hell is he doing or she doing, going over to the other side. So I think it's more difficult to find common ground and compromise because of the way things are going. Through the 80s, things started getting a little bit worse. The Democratic majority, which had been entrenched for so long, particularly when Jim Wright took over as Speaker from Tip O'Neill, kind of treated a lot of the Republicans roughly, and this really rankled a lot of the younger Republicans, particularly Newt Gingrich, who would later become Speaker of the House. So they came up with a plan to disrupt the committee process, to disrupt floor consideration of bills. They started going on C-SPAN, which was still fairly new, and they would stand up there and they would give a speech, and they'd be talking, and they'd be attacking the Democrats or attacking them on issues. And people who are watching C-SPAN or listening and saying, my gosh, darn it, that's really incredible. What you didn't know is the room was totally empty. The House floor, there was nobody there. Democrats later passed a bill that said that the cameras had to span the audience. But it was pretty clever. At any rate, so I joined the Bush administration in 1989, and I'm in charge of relations with the House. Later, after a brief return to the private sector, I come back and I become the assistant to the president for legislative affairs in charge of the entire Congress. It's really a unique and uncommonly challenging job that explores every day the relations and tensions between a constitutionally empowered legislature of 535 people and a constitutionally empowered executive, the president. There have been dozens of books that have examined that relationship and the tensions. And I'd say if you haven't looked at this, it's really worth reading. It's fascinating because the push and the pull of the power and the tugs that occur all the time, where the executive branch goes up, then the legislative branch goes back up, and it's constant. In modern times, it's the White House Office of Legislative Affairs that has been the fulcrum of that tension. It's self-serving, but I can't overstate the importance of this role as head of that office. You serve the commander-in-chief, and you are the chief lint remover, for example. You are in charge of straightening ties, checking for head lice. As a fashion consultant, you also get to work for the First Lady to make sure that the new cushions for the worn-out couches in the Oval Office aren't too big that people can't sit on them. I probably was not the best test case. And then finally, in a lot of ways, both inside the White House and on Capitol Hill, you are a punching bag, because that's your job, to take grief from both sides, to try to bring both sides together. On a more serious note, the Office of Legislative Affairs does, or can, I don't think it's doing it right now because of the person in charge, not of that office, but because of how this president operates, an important role in making compromises happen. The president can propose legislation, but neither he nor anyone inside the White House can vote on that legislation. As a legislative affairs officer, you probably remind people of that daily as they tell you, go tell them that they need to do this or they need to do that. Only the Congress gets the vote, and it's your job to find those votes. The office is a vote counting machine, but it's not just numbers. It's how you find the votes, how you bring people, how you persuade people to that point of view. And that requires getting 218 votes in the House, or 51 or 60 in the Senate, depending if there's a filibuster. To do that requires the kind of scout work I was talking about before. I would say candidly, we had encyclopedic knowledge about every member who mattered, whose vote we might possibly get, from everything going on in their district to their families, to their time in office, what their newspapers were saying back home. In his book about the White House staff, Bradley Patterson devotes a chapter to the Office of Legislative Affairs, and he titles it "An Ambulatory Bridge Across a Constitutional Gulf." The phrase, I think, is incredibly apt, because the gulf is not always constitutional. It's between the Capitol and the White House, but it requires so much shoe leather going back between the parties at the White House and in the administration and in the Congress to try to inch them closer, to get the information you need to talk to them, bring them around to the point of view where you can actually get a deal. You work for the president, he's your constituent, so are the rest of the White House staff and your cabinet. And then Patterson asks, I think about it, do you fire across the partisan divide, or do you reach across the partisan divide? Always a question. He calls it a venerable debate because it occurs in every administration. Usually, legislative affairs people will argue reach across, because if you don't, you can't get the votes to win. And if you can't win, you can't get any part of your agenda. So it's just common sense. You don't have to be a mathematical genius, and anyone who knows me knows I can't do long division. But I can count votes, and it's a matter of getting those votes to come together. To do that, you have to gain their trust, and that requires a lot of different things. At the start of Bush 41, the Democrats held a 260 to 175 seat majority in the House and a 55-45 majority in the Senate. So like I said, do the math. You had to get Democratic votes, and we were able to because of the style of Bush 41, reaching across the aisle, and we were able to do things like rewrite and expand the Clean Air Act, the Civil Rights Act, write the Americans with Disabilities Act, and a whole host of other issues. We could rely on reaching across the aisle if we were appropriate, acted the right way, and treated people the right way to work with a block of potential Democratic votes. So we were constantly on Capitol Hill. We were in formal meetings. We hung out all the time so members would see us, so it's kind of a natural thing to talk. And that's important because you have to be around. You can't just go talk to people when you want something from them. You've got to create that level of trust, which is why it is a people's business. The president's his own chief lobbyist, and just, it's kind of a minor sidelight interest. You do have a lot of resources through the president. There's meetings at the White House with the president. You know, he can have people up for informal coffees and drinks, which they did. There's trips on Air Force One. The use of the president has a box at the Kennedy Center. You can give that away for a night to members of Congress. There's signed photos of the member with the president that they then, of course, hang in their office. There's signed photos of the president just by himself, signing for their constituents, White House tours. Anyway, like I said, you need to be around and pay attention. The biggest criticism the Democrats on Capitol Hill had of President Obama was that he and his people were never around, that they called when they needed a vote. That is not a path to success, and it will more often than not fail because people like to be felt like you have a stake in them and want to talk to them. So our reach across the aisle, I have to say, did not make all Republicans happy. The rift in the Republican Party between the Newt Gingrich-led rebels and what I called the old bulls, who thought, the young people thought the older guys were being too cooperative with the Democrats, was boiling over at the same time as a lot of the younger Democrats who were coming in showed a lot less interest in those kind of personal relationships between members on both sides of the aisle than going out for drinks and talking. For me, the most vivid example of the change that was occurring came on a congressional delegation trip to the Middle East after Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990. There was a question after the invasion of whether we would have to resort to force to get Iraq out of Kuwait, which in turn raised the question of whether we needed a congressional resolution that authorized us to use force. Before we asked for it, the then Speaker of the House, Tom Foley from Washington State, and the then Majority Leader, Dick Gephardt, announced that they would be against any such resolution, which put enormous pressure on the Democratic rank and file. Over Labor Day, we took 2 planes, one House plane, one Senate plane, over to the Middle East. I was on the House plane, and Dick Gephardt, the Majority Leader, was the head of that congressional delegation. It's a very good mix of older and younger members. The reason I'm telling this story is because it's a 15-hour flight. After dinner, most of the Republican members, most of the younger members, both Republicans and Democrats, went off to read or go to sleep on their own. The older members of Congress who were on that plane set up a card table at the front of the plane and proceeded to drink and talk and play cards almost all night long. So I hung around listening to what they were talking about, and for about 2 hours, it was a lot of old war stories, a lot of drinking, a lot of jokes. About 2 hours in, Dante Fascell, who was then the Democratic chairman of the House Foreign Relations Committee, says, and I'm quoting because I wrote it down, "What are we going to do about this? We probably need a resolution." Foley and Gephardt already signaled that they're going to be against it. So he said, "What are we going to do about it?" So what they did was they started talking about the issue, talking about back and forth what they could do, and when it came time for the vote, we worked with them and other Democratic members and passed the resolution. For me, it was a tipping point because it was remarkable to see what had occurred naturally because these people knew each other and trusted each other, and their ability to just talk to each other about an issue upon which they probably didn't fully agree with each other and come to a resolution because they thought it was the best thing for the country under the circumstances. And I know Iraq is not the best example because it's not the most popular, but it is a vivid example of what happened. This is not to say that bipartisanship ended at that point. It certainly didn't. There's multiple examples continuing forward, some of which I'll get into. If you look at, just to be a little topical, after an ill-advised Republican shutdown of the government in 1995, President Clinton and the House Republicans, led by Newt Gingrich, had been at war with each other, and they both needed something because the American public was really pretty angry about the shutdown. Ended up they had this great period where President Clinton and the Republican leadership got together and passed a budget resolution that not only cured the budget deficit, it created a surplus within a few years. They did welfare reform and a whole bunch of other things. By the time I returned to the White House in 2001 with President George W. Bush, Republicans in the House had become very adept at passing legislation with only Republican votes. That's fine, you pass the legislation. What does that mean as a practicality? It means they weren't even talking to the Democrats to try to find common ground where you would give and take a little bit to get the other person's vote. And I must say that the Democrats, when they retook the majority sometime later, showed they learned that lesson very well. That's not a good way to do business in my mind. We have what John Boehner would refer to as knuckleheads on both sides of the aisle. But you empower the knuckleheads by listening to them and not deleveraging them by seeking votes from people in the other party. It's a much better way to do business. And I know I'm old-fashioned, but I do think it's important. So coming off the 2000 election, which you all know was very bitter, Republicans had a 50-50 split in the Senate. And given that the vice president could break a tie vote, they had the majority. Republicans had a 7-vote majority in the House. Two of President Bush's major priorities off the campaign were tax reductions and education reform. The pundits predicted that given the closeness and bitterness of the election, and given the closeness of the ratios, which I would have killed for in Bush 41, to be honest, to be at that close, that nothing would happen. The president had governed in a bipartisan fashion in Texas. He decided that he was going to do the same thing in Washington. He was going to learn subsequently that it wasn't as easy as it was in Texas. In addition, though, he decided he would govern like he had a mandate. To do so, required that he and we reach down Pennsylvania Avenue to Capitol Hill and across the aisle to Democrats, as well as trying to keep our Republicans in line. The outreach started the very first day that he took office. And every time a president has any meeting, there's something called a briefing paper. These are just the tops of a bunch of briefing papers from those first few days in office in 2001, where the president had Republicans down, Democrats down, bipartisan groups down. At the end of 3 weeks, he had met with virtually every member of the United States Congress, and many more than once, and many, many more than twice and 3 times. And that was kept up. The meetings weren't one-offs. It was intended to be a charm offensive, to be honest, but it was also intended to lay the groundwork for getting things done on a long-term basis. So the legislative affairs staff reinforced these, the cabinet members did, White House staff did, and we continue with these meetings all throughout at least my 2 years there and onward. Does it always work? No, but it sure helps because people will listen to you because you're paying attention to them and you know that you value their points of view on things. As a result, we did get the tax cut. 12 Democratic senators voted for it. On the education bill, the president made it clear that he wanted a bipartisan bill. And so there was John Boehner, then the chairman of the Education Committee, and Senator Judd Gregg, and Ted Kennedy and George Miller, who were the Democratic ranking members of those committees. Kennedy and Miller were classic old-time liberals. Kennedy, however, which a lot of people don't realize, was one of the best legislators to ever grace the Senate. He had a lifelong habit of reaching across the aisle because all he wanted to do was get stuff done. And to do that, he would reach across the aisle and work with anybody who was willing to work with him. A very object lesson. So he and the president both wanted education reform. We all knew that the trade-offs were going to have to be significant on both sides to come to some kind of conclusion on the issue. It almost never happened. We were moving along, but the further along we got into it, as we gave the Democrats things they wanted, the White House we gave, and they gave us things that we said that we wanted, the rank and file on the Republican side started to get really edgy. They didn't believe that it held with conservative principles. Democrats got anxious about Kennedy and Miller on their side of the aisle. All were complaining, and at one point we have a request from the Republican leadership in the House to meet with the president. So the president, Vice President Cheney, Chief of Staff Andy Card, and I are meeting with them, the Republican leadership of the House, along with John Boehner, who's plain as late, it's his bill. So the Republican leadership is making the case to the president, you need to go partisan on this, our members are very unhappy, we will get you a bill with all Republican votes. So I say, because I believe it is a staff person's job to speak up appropriately, I said that I thought, Mr. President, that would be a mistake. It would be a mistake because you said all along you wanted a bipartisan bill. That's how we proceeded. We've gained Democrats' trust on this and other issues. If we do this, we pull the rug out from under this in the process, and we will pay for it later on other issues. If looks could kill, I would have been dead on the floor of the Oval Office that year. As it was, there were anonymously sourced stories in the newspapers the next day about basically what a jerk I was, all good. We ended up getting the bill signed, and everybody was happy. It's a good result, but we couldn't have done it if we hadn't done it in a bipartisan fashion. Now, the only reason I tell that story is because disagreements are not only between the parties and not only between the Congress and the president, they're inside the parties. We're seeing that now. I think we're about to see a lot more of that. And I mentioned the picture before that had Boehner and Obama in it. They made a play at getting a major budget economic compromise early into Obama's administration. It failed because both the president and Boehner got yanked back by their own rank and file. They didn't want the agreement. Each side was giving up too much. It's kind of a stupid way to govern, in my view, to just state my opinion. But I've often talked about bipartisanship as a garden that requires a lot of tending. The aftermath of September 11, 2001 is the greatest example. In the aftermath of the attacks, we were all united. There was so much to do. Rebuilding New York, rebuilding our security systems, getting airplanes back up in the air, all sorts of things. And there was this huge array of legislative proposals to be considered. We were meeting all these different meetings every day. We were meeting with the leadership of the House and Senate at breakfast virtually every other day. It was all going really well. About 4 weeks in, the rank and file started telling their leadership that you're giving too much to the White House and the Republicans, and that we were giving too much to the Democrats, and the Republican leadership was giving too much to the Democrats. So it started to dissipate over time. A lot got done, but I think it was emblematic of the view that if you give the other party potential wins, even if it's bipartisan, well, you can claim credit too, that may not be enough for the electorate. So I think with each passing year, it's gotten a little more difficult, and I've named a bunch of the reasons. I won't name again, 24-hour news cycle, the tensions within the parties. I do think social media is having a huge impact because it keeps people stuck with where they are because you get attacked so quickly if you stray at all and reach out, and it's a terrible place to be. Also, I think that if you look at the current makeup of the House and Senate, a lot of them don't know about the old days that I talk about and root for all the time, because the turnover has been so tremendous in the last 20 years. I mean, in the last election, 70 plus members of the House left, either on their own or by losing, the highest number since 1974. Less than 1/3 of current Republicans have ever been in the minority, and they're about to get a good taste of it, would be my guess. Only about half of the Democrats have ever served in the majority. So they don't know the way it used to be. And the way the system runs now, they have done a good job with ethics reform rules, so you can't go out to dinner with anybody, you can't socialize. So what you have all the time are fundraisers, and these members are fundraising all the time, and then they go home for the weekend. They're in Washington for a brief period. They don't get to know their neighbors. They don't get to know each other. And again, it's easier to attack somebody if you don't know them. So they just kind of pass in the night all the time. They vote, they go home. So, by way of wrapping up, I want to share a question, and I will be wrapping up very shortly, that I was asked recently when I spoke to a business group, the 10 most important lessons I've learned or advice that I've been given. So, this is my mother first and foremost. Always put yourself in the other person's shoes, which she did remarkably well at to allow me to do some really stupid things at times because she understood why I wanted to do it. Don't fight every fight like it's last one. Your ally today can be your ally tomorrow, particularly when you're working on legislation or you're in business. This was a Rostenkowskiism. No bird flies so high that it doesn't have to come down for a drink of water. So you can be up one day, you will inevitably be down the next. Just be nice to everybody on the way up. They might remember you on the way down. I told you this before, I've said this before, don't come around just when you need something. I've told my kids this a million times, never raise your head too high or too low. If you want answers, start by looking in the mirror. Congress is usually an absolute reflection of the American people. Everybody wants to criticize, but we elect them, right? And they're representing us. And then the rest you can see, and that's fine. And we'll get to wrap because I want to have time for questions, and I know that some people have to get going. So, with all that said, there's all these truisms. So can everybody read this? Yeah. This is another cartoon in my office. It's one of my favorite.
Nick, you must have a big office.
I do, Kevin. I always thought that this was true. And I've often, as a staff person, used this as a piece of advice from my boss, like, think about this. Everybody's saying we need to do this. You don't have to do it just because they're saying it, but sometimes listen. Now, when 10,000, assholes speak with one voice, people apparently don't have to pay heed, but I think they should. So, to wrap up, most of these truisms, for want of a better term, speak to the value of personal relationships, common decency, and in my mind, face-to-face communications. You can't look an email or a text in the eye and judge the nuance of what someone is saying. I don't think that Twitter and Instagram should be a negotiating tool. If you look at the government shutdown, would anyone want to argue the point that it might have been avoided altogether or ended sooner if it hadn't been fully on camera the entire time or subject to social media? So what's the answer? To the students here and to the adults, I would recommend the answer is to get involved and help bring about change. That's also a truism, but it can be done. You can make a difference. Winston Churchill once said that democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others that have been tried. And when I was in the White House, we met with scores of legislators from emerging democracies who wanted to know how we did it without violence and this changeover and how you could change your presidency. It's an important point. So we do have something to work with. Things are not good right now. I do think they're dysfunctional. Can they get better? Yes. If people get involved, if people want to make a difference, because there's always room for talent, there's always room for new ideas, and always room for commitment in public service. So that's all I would say, except for one final truism, which I do live by because we're almost at that point. It's a mistake to sell wine just to sell it. If you have it, you should drink it. So with that, thank you very much. Any questions, comments?
Microphone if those who have questions.
You mentioned at the very beginning of your talk about how a liberal arts education you think gives you a way of thinking that is different. I just wondered if you would like to elaborate on that at all. Talk about how maybe being an English major and having a liberal arts education made you more adept at reaching across the aisle and being bipartisan.
It was getting to know, first of all, I think it was the atmosphere at the school, the social atmosphere, and getting to know people with different economic backgrounds. But in terms of the education, it was studying and learning a way to think, learning how to write, learning how to speak. I talk to a lot of young people, and when they come in and they don't look me in the eye and they say you know or like or a gazillion times, that's a problem. So we learned how to speak. There was a rigorous writing requirement at the time, and the exposure to a wide range of topics and looking at what happened and how the subjects interrelated with each other. So I think it gives you a broader way of thinking, a broader way of approaching problems. Excuse me.
Nick, great talk. One question. If you could change one thing of all the litany that went through, what would be the one change you would think that would make the biggest impact in all the issues you talked about?
Boy, George, that's a hard question.
I'll give you two. How's that?
What's that? Two?
Give you two. By Alpha.
I think, actually, probably the biggest thing that I would have changed was when Congress was turning in on itself and writing ethics rules, in part because there had been abuses, but they overreacted and they cut themselves off from each other, and it became a sin to socialize and talk. And also in terms of the way the districts are drawn. There are some states now looking at changing how districts are drawn, which I think would be a very positive thing, because the way they're drawn now, it creates a partisanship that's hyperactive, and it leaves the middle, anybody who's moderate. And by moderate, it's a pretty broad term. You know, you can be a conservative Republican and be moderate in today's world. Leaves those members exposed to primary challenges. So probably those two things. Amy?
I was just wondering what your opinion was on the filibuster.
I'm sorry?
On the filibuster?
Where I am on it?
Yeah, what's your opinion on the filibuster as a technique?
I think as a tool, is valuable and constitutionally empowered. I think the people who exercise it today could use to be a lot more responsible about it. It is overused. It used to be rarely used on really big issues, and now members do it all the time, and I think that's a mistake. I think it brings the Senate to its knees. The Senate's supposed to be the more deliberative body. Being more deliberative does not mean being frozen in place and unable to do anything.
You said you were an English major. What's your favorite book?
As Lydia could tell you, favorites are hard for me. I have many favorite books. I don't know that I can answer that, honestly. I read a lot, and I have a lot of favorite books. What's yours?
My response is pretty much exactly what yours is. It's a really hard question, so that's why I asked it.
Yeah, but it gets back to the liberal arts education. There's so much out there and so much to read that's so entertaining, so informative. I read a lot of junk. I read a lot of serious books. I read a lot of biographies. It's just, there's a lot to learn. So the key is read. You'll learn a lot.
Hi, this might be a weird question, but do you wish you were in the Trump administration right now to see if you could help whatever's going on right now?
No.
And if you, no? Okay.
No, okay. To be honest, I get asked that question a lot. I am not being glib. I left the White House in 2003, and the way things developed, I once told President Bush 43, when Lydia and I were having lunch with him, if I worked for you now, the Republicans would hang me. And I meant that because bipartisanship wasn't tolerated. To me, it was just a way of life. And here's the thing, though. I could tell a gazillion war stories about talking to the president when he didn't want to listen to me or didn't want to do something, but he would oftentimes eventually listen. And you have to have a principal that is willing to listen to you. And if you don't, then you really don't have a job. And the other thing is, in the congressional affairs job, you have to be able to go to Capitol Hill and have people know that you are speaking for the president. Both the presidents that I worked for made clear that if I spoke to them and made a promise, I was speaking for the president. And they never pulled the rug out from under me. Sometimes you took a little leeway. 43 in particular was good about, defending me when we were doing it to get votes. But no, would I want to? No, because I couldn't make any difference. There's been some good people there, and a lot of them are leaving. It's a very difficult situation. It's sad to say. If I could be Superman and go in and have him listen, because my advice to the president would be very simple. If you want to win, do what you said at the last night's start of the State of the Union. Reach out to people, unite, work on a bipartisan basis. It's amazing what could happen if you led.
I can tell you I wish that you were with them right now.
Thank you. That's very nice. Any more? Great.
Questions?
You're talking about a relationship really of the executive to the Congress and the legislature. But the problem now is that the executive is not united. I mean, you cannot. How can you represent a president and also represent the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State when they come out with diametrically opposed views? And how can you collaborate and how can you put those things together? It seems almost impossible situation.
Professor Lyman, I think that it is an impossible situation. Lydia, my younger daughter, is leaving her job at the Pentagon this Friday. And she had worked very closely with Mattis and Shanahan. And it's an odd situation when you have, for instance, your foreign policy chiefs and your intelligence chiefs come out and say something, and they're told to go back to school. And I frankly find it a little bit frightening in terms of where we are, because, like any executive, a president is only as good as his or her staff. And you have to hire those people so you can rely on them. And if you're not going to take their advice, it gets back to the question here. Why would I not want to be there? My advice is worthless because I'd say what I thought. So we'll have to see how it plays out over time. But I've told a lot of people, there are prerogatives and proprieties built up around the institution of the presidency that are designed to protect both the institution and the person, whoever that person is that holds the office. But you have to care about those, and you have to understand them. And if you don't, the rest all goes by the wayside.
Along those lines, if not now, when would the 25th Amendment ever be used?
I can't answer that. I think you have a long way to go to get there, to be honest. It's just, there's some Democrats calling for it now. I think it would be, there's ads on TV. I think it's a mistake to go there. Let's try to do a self-correction.
So even though we find this administration to be problematic or dysfunctional, one of the positive sides is in this administration we have the highest number of young people working, like millennials. And so also with that and with the newest Congress, we also have a large number of young people. So clearly we're in the beginning of seeing a generational shift, or the next generation coming of age and running the country. I want to know, what are your thoughts on the polarization? Do you think it's going to get worse because we are, well, I'm speaking like me and Francesca, we are coming of age, and we saw what Newt Gingrich did and we saw what Boehner did. And so I'm wondering, do you think that it's going to get even worse, or maybe our generation, maybe we'll try to bring it back to the days of old politics, reaching across the aisle, trying to promote bipartisanship?
Okay, you want a candid answer? I would tell your generation to occasionally turn off their email and Instagram and Twitter, start talking to people and looking them in the eye when they talk, get involved, think about what you don't know, and learn from other people, because you can make a difference in how things happen. And somebody on my staff suggested that I talk about go forward, commit your passion, and ignore the blowhards on each side. And actually, now that you ask the question, that's pretty good advice, and a lot of that comes from TV and other media, because it's all red meat, it's all winners and losers, there's no considered discussion. And somehow we have to crack through that. I'm not a big media basher, but I do think it's a problem. If you watch those talk shows, I was thinking the other day about, can you imagine Winston Churchill, after he said about democracy, watched MSNBC or Fox or CNN when those panels are on there? It's crazy as far as people aren't talking to each other, they're yelling, and you put a premium on yelling, not talking to each other.
Nick, you mentioned the importance of being moderate. But what are the risks of what challenges do moderates face? Why are they sometimes a scarce breed?
They get thrown out of office.
I thought.
Thank you. Hi. Thanks for coming. Relating back to this idea of what we perceive to be true based on the kinds of media that we're consuming versus what is really true. So Nicholas Kristof in early January for the past couple of years has written an article that is titled something like, "This year, believe it or not, was the best year in human history to be alive." And then he supports that claim with lots of data about literacy rates, poverty rates that are descending, et cetera. And I consistently get the impression that we are hearing so much negativity. And even today, this morning, my husband and I wake up together and we watch the news, and We hear again and again about how divided we are as a nation and how this is unprecedented division. And of course there is division. The degree to which it's unprecedented is questionable. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between the kinds of media we consume, the way that those people who are working for those media corporations are incentivized to report, and the way it affects our perception of reality.
Okay. So have you ever noticed at the end of a broadcast, after a lot of negative stories, they do their one feel-good story? That's both on local news and national news. And that's part of the problem. So I have friends who are reporters, national reporters, and we talk about it all the time. I talk to them sometimes in reference to the airline industry, and they tell me, look, if I get this story, I know I'm on TV that night. So I'm going with it. And that, again, was what I was mentioning. People are incentivized to come up with the negative, and there is a lot of positive. One thing that I forgot to talk about when I talked about that we have a lot that we're challenged right now, but we do have a lot to work with because of our system, and it might not be always pretty, but it does work. There are people coming together inside the Congress. There's a group of Democrats and Republicans that have formed this caucus now. It's called the Problem Solvers Caucus, and they're very vigorous about who they let in terms of vetting them, because you have to be willing to buck your leadership to go for it. There are people like Rob Portman's a good example here from Ohio. He constantly reaches across the aisle, sometimes gets his head chopped off for it. So you just have to encourage and support people who do that, and then I think call people out. That's not a really good answer, in terms of something specific on how to do it, but it's being aware and not just buying into this and then calling people out when they start telling you that, no, this is the way it is, or that's the way it is, and they're getting all their sound bites off of negative TV. Okay? Great. Thank you very much.